there is a lot more to reality than what meets the eye. And you probably say, well, no shit, Daniel, of course there's more to reality than what meets the eye. But the thing is, we often don't know the extent of it. Because, let me tell you, there is a lot of things out there that can affect us emotionally, spiritually, energetically, and even physically that we can't really perceive just with our regular five senses. And some people may be able to perceive these things, but for most of us, we can't. So to us, these are invisible concepts, but we realize that there's a toll. That many people who are facing mental illness or have some sort of issues, whether it's depression or anxiety, or maybe they just have no hope, or they have no zest in life. And perhaps these people have tried many different things. They've been to therapy, they've tried all these medications, and just nothing seems to work. This is usually because, at least in my experiences, there is an external influence. And when I say an external influence, what I'm talking about is an attachment. So the thing is that there are spirits everywhere, right? And some of us can learn how to perceive these spirits just regularly. Some of us learn how to perceive them through different spiritual pathways, through modalities, such as shamanic healing or mediumship or clairvoyance, developing these spiritual abilities where we can learn to perceive another level of reality. And the thing is that in this level of reality, it is constantly interacting with us on this level of reality. So they are very interconnected. They aren't, the spiritual realms, at least some layers of the spiritual realms, aren't necessarily separate to what we are experiencing here in reality. So many different spirits, many different entities and attachments can actually jump onto us or hold onto us or attach to us through what we do within our physical reality, within our decisions or our actions or the places we go or the things that we are exposed to as human beings. Because energetically, we are also exposing ourselves to all these different things out there. And for many of us, we are protected, at least to some degree, but many of us aren't as well. And for most of us, we don't even know that there are many different spirits and entities out there that will jump on the opportunity to attach to you if you are vulnerable. Because in these spiritual dimensions or these spiritual layers of reality, let's say the astral planes, there's many different entities. So many of these entities are good, many of them are neutral, and many of these entities are also dark, which means they are manifestations of darkness or suffering or pain. And many of these entities will attach to vulnerable people when they are energetically exposed. So let's really get into what entity attachment is. I'm going to break this down in this video and tell you what I know about it, because it's a pretty complicated topic, but there is a lot to know, and it is important to know as well, because you might be affected by an external influence that isn't your own mind. And think about that. If you are experiencing depression or some sort of form of mental illness or emotional dysfunction and you can't seem to get rid of it, I'm not saying that maybe it is your mind, but maybe it isn't your mind as well. Spiritual attachment occurs when an entity or a spirit latches to your energetic body. And often these spirits are quite dark in nature, they don't have good intentions, and they are sort of like parasites. So the way I look at an attachment is like a parasite, the same way that we physically get a parasite. When you get a parasite, it drains your resources and it sort of takes nutrients away from you and it feeds off you. This is what a spiritual attachment will do. So if an entity is attached to you, then it will start feeding from you energetically. And malevolent entities or dark entities that are out there, they feed off low vibrational energy. Low vibrational energy is any energy that is unpleasant or dark or just not good to experience. So for example, energies of resentment or hatred or even anger is somewhat low vibrational. Guilt, shame are other examples of low vibrational energy. So when we experience an energy that we consider to be negative or dark, this is what we call low vibrational energy. And entities, essentially, they feed off low vibrational energy. So they attach to you and they try to make you, they twist you around in your minds and your beliefs and whatever to make you experience more low vibrational energy in whatever form it takes. So sometimes low vibrational energy might be in the form of resentment. So if you have an attachment, you might feel very, very resentful for no reason, and you might not be able to get rid of it. You might think this is just your own fucked up consciousness causing this, or your mind, but in reality, it could be an entity that is actually exacerbating these feelings so that it can just sort of sip off you, that it can keep feeding off this energy. And likewise, this is why, at least in my perspective, people who are depressed or anxious or in these really negative states where they can't see the light, I think many of these people do have entities attached to them, especially if they are trying everything they can to get out of these states and to heal themselves and to improve themselves, and they can't seem to do it, and it just lasts with them for essentially ever. This could be the result of an entity that is actually attached to them and causing them to feel this way, or exacerbating feelings that are there and sort of messing with their mind so that they experience more low vibrational energy so that the entity can keep feasting off it. So I've seen a few examples of entity attachments working in the shamanic healing space. So one place that I worked at in Ecuador for about 6 months, there was a shaman who was very good at perceiving these entities, especially with the medicine of Wachuma. So during ceremonies, people would often start acting weird and not their usual selves. I was in many of these ceremonies either helping out or just participating in them, and I noticed this in people as well. They started acting weird, they started not being their usual self, and the shaman right away would see that there was something attached to them that they brought in with them. So what happens in this case is that the shaman did a ceremony or a ritual and essentially exiled the attachment, where the people in almost every case felt physically different afterwards. They felt something change in their own personality and the state of consciousness, and it was almost like a big relief. I saw this happen with many different people. Then other times, sometimes when it got really bad and the entity refused to let go or go to the light, then it actually turned into a full-blown possession. So one time when I was working at a medicine community in Pisac, Peru, there was a woman there who had a full-blown demonic, or I don't know whether it was demonic, but a bad spirit, a possession. And essentially this was maybe 3 hours after a ayahuasca ceremony. So I was sharing a dorm with her, and I noticed singing, but it was very off-setting coming from that dorm. And during the time, I thought she was just going through a process and sort of working through, whatever she experienced during the ceremony, because it's pretty normal to act a little bit weird after a ceremony. Often people go through their own integration processes, so it didn't ring any alarms for me. But I thought, okay, I'm going to give this lady some space just to work through this process and integrate it. And the singing got louder and louder and louder and more offbeat, so it started to sound really, really strange. And this is when I started thinking, this sort of is odd, but I don't want to go in and disturb her because I don't know what's going on. So I'll just sit out here and wait for her to finish her process so I can go back into the dorm room and collect my stuff, because that's why I wanted to go in there. So the singing got louder until it became full-blown screaming. Like, she was full screaming at the top of her lungs and almost like chanting some sort of strange dialect, but it wasn't any language that I recognized, and it was sort of like a melody, but it was just a strange thing. Then suddenly the bedroom door flew open and she ran out and she was circling the kitchen, just like pacing laps around it, just full screaming. And at that point I'm like, okay, this is really strange, but I don't really know what to do. I was a little bit concerned for the neighbors, because I'm like, okay, this is pretty late. It's like maybe 10 p.m. and this is going to wake up the neighbors because she's full screaming. And then moments later, the shaman walks in and he grabs her and he walks her out to the fire that some people had, because this was post-ceremony. So people often just hang by the fire, playing music and relaxing and integrating their experiences. So he grabbed her and walked her to the fire, and I heard them talking that they saw a spirit in her that was coming out because of the medicine. So they did an exorcism which lasted for about 3 hours, and At this time, I went to bed, so I'm like, okay, these guys are professionals, they know how to deal with it, this isn't my realm, so I'm just going to go to bed. And I did, but I heard her screaming like the entire night, and just, it sounded pretty brutal. Like, I didn't know what was happening, and I felt a little bit off, especially since I was staying in the same dorm as her. So I didn't want her to come in, like, in the middle of the night and wake up with her crawling on my bed, biting my neck or something. So I was a little bit on edge after that. And I heard the shamans, because there's two of them, talking about it's a female entity that attached to her. It came out during the medicine. Now they need to exorcise it because it full like came out. And this is what shamanic medicine does sometimes. So often many of us have attachments, and when you drink the medicine, whether it's during the ceremony or later, the spirit sort of flushes to the surface, and the spirit sees it as a threat. So what happens when the spirit sees the medicine as a threat, because it identifies it and it flushes it to the surface where it can be seen by the host or by the shaman to be cleared away, it turns into a possession. So it gets aggressive and nasty and actually tries to take control of the consciousness of the person experiencing it. So what happened later, so about 3 hours later or whatever, it seemed to die down, I fell asleep, and the next day I spoke to the lady, and she said, yeah, after the ceremony, she's sort of feeling the medicine a bit, and she's just sitting down, integrating the experience. Then suddenly it came on really, really strong, like she's never experienced before. Complete interdimensional. Sometimes you have these experiences when you are working with these medicines. And she said she knew that it was going to be a really dark, bad trip, but she thought that she had to go through it for some sort of reason, because she believed that, you know, it was part of the experience and it was there to serve her growth. So what happened is she surrendered to it, and then suddenly she was trapped in this other dimension, and she lost full control of her body and didn't even know what was happening. So she didn't have any memory of singing or running around the house screaming and chanting and doing all these weird things. At that point, it was a full-blown possession of this malevolent spirit that took over her because the medicine flushed it out. And what the shamans told me is that this occurred after the ceremony because she is protected during the ceremony. So what the spirit does is it waits until the person is vulnerable and not around these healers or not around this sacred space where, you know, they would be flushed away and go to the light. They don't have a chance in this sort of environment. So the spirit waits a few hours until the person is alone and vulnerable and not protected by, you know, the energies of the space or the healers or the shamans. So this is what happened, and she said it was a very traumatic experience that she went through, and that she felt violated in every way. And she really stressed this to me. She said, you know, this was like, I felt very violated, and I will probably need to go to therapy because of this. Like, this was a very traumatic experience. I had no control. And I believed her, because this was, like, this wasn't just her acting weird or just doing her own thing. Like, this, you could tell, you could feel the energy. Something was really weird about this experience, especially once the shamans collected her. Then it was sort of like confirmation. So that's a story about possession. But in my experiences, possession is usually the result of an attachment. So someone already has the attachment. It's not necessarily how you see in the movies where, you know, someone goes into a haunted house and they do some weird ritual, then suddenly they're possessed by a demon. It doesn't really work like that. I think that can happen, but usually, at least in my experiences, possessions occur from spiritual attachments. So when someone has an attachment and it's been flushed up, the attachment can get aggressive and take over the person's consciousness as a way for it to survive. Because the attachment, like, they're not dumb. These spirits are often actually intelligent. And they know that if they get exorcised or they get flushed out, they're going to the light and it's death. It's transmutation into source, into raw energy where they can be created into another soul or something else. So that is death to that entity or to that ego, however you want to perceive it. But the point I'm trying to make is that attachments are actually quite common, and many of us have them. Attachments really screw us up in ways that we don't understand, because we often think that it's us. We often think that we have some sort of mental illness or some sort of problem or some sort of issue, but it can't be resolved. So it just gets worse and worse and worse, and often it leads to suicide and even some pretty nasty things such as perversion, such as people murdering other people. So I think there's a lot of attachments. Let's say in politics, I do believe there are a lot of entity attachments and demonic entities in many governments around the world. This is why they can do such terrible things under the radar, and they seem to have no moral compasses. Of course, this is a generalization. I'm not talking about every government and every person. There's many good people in governments as well. Often organizations such as the cartel, I believe there would be a lot of different attachments there, which, is sort of playing off these energies. So it's causing them to feel more of these energies, which make them more malevolent and aggressive and angry and resentful, because these people are low-hanging fruit. So people who are suffering are low-hanging fruit to entities. Entities want to jump into people who are already suffering because they have no protection. So if you are someone who is suffering a lot, or you're experiencing a lot of low vibrational energy in whatever way, and you're not protecting yourself, you're not protected, maybe you're not doing the healing, and you just feel vulnerable, this is often an easy entrance for a spirit to attach to you. Because they'll see that, this person is really suffering, this person's going through hell, this means it's a good meal for me, so I'm going to jump on this person and start sucking away at this energy because it is a feast. So this is what attachments do. This is what malevolent spirits do. They attach to people who are suffering, and they try to exacerbate that suffering so that they can get more food, essentially, because they are feeding off that low vibrational energy. Entities that are attached to you can cause all sorts of problems in your life. So think of any negative thing or any strange thing you can experience that is low vibrational. They can either exacerbate that or cause it. So, for example, a lot of perversion out there, and people who are, let's go into some pretty dark territory here, people who are sex trafficking or doing these really dark things, they have entities attached to them, because I don't think any normal human being can actually want this stuff. And maybe it started off just through their own suffering, through some sort of sick outlet, but an entity probably joined in and said, hey, this looks like fun, I'm going to join in and make this even worse and make you experience more perversion and whatever. Perversion is often an attachment causing it. Aggressive tendencies, so like if you are overly aggressive and you are overly cruel to people, then that can be an attachment as well. People who are sort of losing themselves and they don't know who they are anymore, and they're going through some really not necessarily a dark night of the soul, because that's natural along the spiritual growth journey, but people who are going into dark places and maybe exploring things that they shouldn't. This can be entity attachments as well, making them curious in dark arts and black magic and things that are bad, essentially, because these things end up hurting the host or the person who does it, causing the entity to feed more off the person. And also just people who are depressed, people who don't have any vision of their life and just have no hope and just feel like they're sucked into this hole, and it is really deep, it is really dark, and they can't get out of it. This is often an example of an entity attachment as well. So the thing about entity attachments is that we often don't know that we have them. This is the thing about having an attachment, is that they are on our energetic body, which we can't regularly perceive unless we are at a very high level of spiritual growth and spiritual understanding, where we have cultivated these abilities. So it can be difficult to know whether you have an entity or whether it is your own stuff happening, whether it's just your mind or your emotional body or a manifestation of trauma. But from what I understand, many of us have entities. Entities can also be passed sexually. So if someone has a negative entity attached to them and they have sex with someone else, this entity can pass to this other person. So maybe you know of someone, maybe you've even had an experience yourself where you had sex with someone who probably wasn't good for you. Maybe they were an addict, maybe they had some sort of like big mental issues or something, or they're just a low vibrational person. Perhaps you started feeling really negative after this happened, and you felt like you had something that you just couldn't get rid of, and you don't know why your consciousness or your life experience took a turn for the worst after you had sex with this person. And the reason is because they could have passed you an entity. So entities often pass through sexual transmission. So you definitely need to be careful with who you have sex with and who you are energetically letting into your life, because if we are exchanging a lot of energies with people who aren't good for us, low vibrational, or they have dirty energy, meaning they probably have some sort of like cosmic parasites or entity attachments and they're into some dark or weird stuff, then these entities can pass on to us as well, especially if we are feeling vulnerable. So it is important to prioritize your own energy and your own healing, and don't let people interact with your energy who are bad for you. And if you must, then try and keep it to a minimum, because you need to protect your own energy, because there's a lot of stuff out there that can pass to you or that can attach to you if you aren't careful. And you don't want these entities or these energies attached to you, because they can make your life a living hell. And I believe this is a big reason why many people commit suicide or many people feel depressed or anxious, because there are a lot of entities, especially in Western society where we don't really recognize this stuff. Like maybe in the church we do, but otherwise entity attachment isn't much of a recognized thing in Western society, so many people have entities because they don't know how to remove them, they don't know that they have them. I think in societies where there's a strong shamanic presence or indigenous culture where they might have a higher perception of these sort of occurrences and these spiritual things, there's probably less depression, less anxiety, less perversion, less addiction, less things that suck for the consciousness and cause harm to themselves or other people, because they know how to deal with these entities and they know how to work with them and they know how to perceive them. So I do believe that our society, especially, there are many different entities around, and they are just having a great time because they are feasting on so many people out there who have no awareness that these entities exist. The only real way that I know how to remove entities is through shamanic medicine. So being in shamanic ceremonies where perhaps you are taking ayahuasca or wachuma or bufo or some sort of medicine that can help flush these things to the surface. So plant medicines in general might be able to help entities, but I definitely recommend going with a trusted healer, going to Latin America where you can actually, you know, work with these medicines in ceremonies where the people can perceive these entities and they know what they're doing. This is, I'd say, the most common way of removing entities. There probably are certain rituals and different things that people can do, maybe cleansings, that might help remove entities, although I'm not entirely sure. I would be a little bit skeptical if someone says, oh, I can remove an entity for you just by, you know, like tapping into it and removing it psychically, which I believe does exist. I do believe people can do that, but I think most people claiming to do that probably don't have the necessary abilities or skills to actually tap into these entities and perceive them and flush them out, especially if they're not using any crafts or tools to do it. So I think what you can do if you do suspect that you have an entity is first, be mindful that it might be your own mind. It might not actually be an entity. This might be a actual case of mental illness or some sort of emotional dysfunction. So I do suggest, you know, trying the usual ropes first. So healing yourself, maybe going to therapy, talking to people you trust, and doing what you can to actually improve your state of well-being. And perhaps it is just a chemical in your brain, perhaps it is just some trauma that's manifesting in different ways. So you can't be entirely sure, but again, I suggest being a bit careful of that, because I know a lot of people are saying, oh, I've got an attachment, what do I do? But I honestly think for many of these cases, it's just that person's going through a dark spot, and it might not actually be an entity, so definitely be aware of that. But if you do really, if you are struggling with these things, and perhaps it's been a long time, months or years, dealing with this problem, and you've tried everything and you don't know what to do, and you really suspect that you have an entity, then I suggest going to South America and doing a shamanic retreat. And I know many reputable places where you don't need to pay much money at all to do an ayahuasca ceremony, or work with a healer who is very knowledgeable and is doing it due to service, not doing it to make money. It's not necessarily like a big business that they're just trying to make money from. And that's really everything I have to say about this topic. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you've learned something. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please consider liking and subscribing and following my content Otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Take care.